Not every series that has a bad first episode is going to end up being a complete disaster, because oftentimes that pilot will include some mistakes that end up getting changed for the second episode, and the series can go on to do well. Unfortunately, that's absolutely not the case here, because even though the first episode was trash, the second episode somehow managed to be worse. And guess what? It's gonna continue going down from here. The Witcher Blood Origin is bad, episode 2. Something I want to briefly mention is that I haven't watched the rest of this series yet. I watch one episode at a time and then make a review video on it. I do this for two reasons. First, I want to be able to make some predictions and maybe see if they come true later on in the series. And secondly, I don't think I could mentally handle it if I sat down and watched more than one episode of this show in a single sitting. I think it would probably hurt my brain. We open with the introduction of another diversity checkmark. I mean, another one of these stunning and brave characters. This time it's a female dwarf carrying a hammer that's as tall as she is, and she wants to go into this tavern brothel sort of looking place because she's looking for a specific elf who apparently did some naughty things to some of the other dwarves. And they won't let her in because apparently all the elves in this place hate dwarves, except I guess for the one that she's looking for or something. I don't know. Anyways, she sneaks in through the side of the building. And when I say that she sneaks in, I mean I have to put that in air quotes because she knocks out a window that everyone in the building would have heard, and there's absolutely no way that basically everyone would be completely aware of her presence at this point. Then the camera starts slowly panning up through the building, and we hear sounds of people fighting until finally a guy is launched out of one of the windows from the upper floor. Tinkerbell hops out after him and she's covered in blood. The idea is that she killed a whole bunch of fully grown men that are twice her size. Of course, we didn't get to see any of this, which makes it all the more very convenient, since there is absolutely no way that Tinkerbell over here would have been able to actually defeat all these grown men that are twice her size.
I don't believe you.
Some of you might be saying, hang on a second here, she's a dwarf, she should have extra strength, and that means she can actually defeat these guys who are elves, who should be theoretically a little bit weaker than even humans are. And that's how it normally works in a fantasy series. It's kind of a rock, paper, scissors, where humans are kind of the average, and then you have dwarves who are stronger than humans, but they are also a little bit slower, and they have, the height disadvantage. And then you have elves who typically are taller than humans, and they're faster, and they have more agility, but they're also a little bit weaker. And it does create that kind of rock, paper, scissors situation, except that is not how it works in this series. In this series, the elves are effectively the exact same as humans, except they have pointy ears, and the dwarves likewise don't have any extra benefits. Instead, they would be functionally the exact same as a human dwarf in the real life, and would include all of the, shall we say, shortcomings that go along with it, which means they're going to be a little more clumsy, they're not going to be as fast, and they're going to be a little bit weaker. They're going to be prone to more problems and all that sort of stuff. So being a dwarf in this series doesn't actually give you any additional strength, which makes it all the more ridiculous that Tinkerbell was able to defeat an entire building full of grown men twice her size.
It never happened. No way. It never happened.
Also, it's worth mentioning that Tinkerbell seems to be a little bit on the crazy side because she keeps talking to her hammer as if it's alive. Maybe it'll turn out to be magical at some point later on, or maybe she's just fucking crazy.
This is a guy in a serious state of mental decline.
The next scene has Mr. Elfty and the General sitting in a hot tub talking about the current situation with the Empire. The General mentions that Malarkey and Dogman have been spotted, but he's not worried about them. Mr. Elfty, however, suggests that they could build enough of a following among the peasantry to cause serious issues further on. He follows this by saying that whoever controls the story controls the world.
I'm guessing that's significant.
And that line of dialogue really strikes home when you stop and realize that it perfectly summarizes everything that is happening with this series, as well as other shows like Lord of the Rings, Star Trek, House of the Dragon, and others. And that's because the woke weirdos at Disney, Marvel, Star Wars, Star Trek, Netflix, and Hollywood in general also know that is the case. They have control over most every big-name franchise from the last 50 years. They use that control in an attempt to manipulate the audience into believing all of the woke agenda nonsense. Those weirdos are the ones who are controlling the story, and they change it so that ultimately they can change you. He who controls the story controls the world. Switching over to the Fellowship of the Idiots, they arrive at a city that is currently under siege, and apparently this city decided not to join the Empire, and it's currently being destroyed by the 3 armies of those kingdoms that have joined together. So these idiots decide that they need help, and they're going to enlist some sellswords. Mulan says it's possible to get them for the right coin, which is a bunch of bullshit because these idiots are going up against an absolutely massive army that consists of the soldiers from 3 separate kingdoms now folded into one empire. The city that was just destroyed supposedly had never lost a battle in over 1,000 years, and yet it just got completely wrecked. Exactly how many sellswords could you possibly get to fight an army of that size? And where would you even get all of the gold needed to hire them? Not that it matters, because 10 seconds later, we learn that these 3 idiots don't have any gold to begin with anyways. But don't worry, it gets worse. These 3 idiots then arrive at another village which consists of about 4 or 5 buildings, and one of them happens to be an absolutely gigantic bank that's half made out of metal.
Why would they do this?
And I have to ask, why? Why is this even here? There's only about 2 or 3 people milling around in the town, and they couldn't possibly have a population greater than 20 or 30. So for what possible reason would there be to have this gigantic fortified bank in the middle of nowhere in a village that's in the middle of the forest? It simply doesn't make any sense. Having this sort of thing in the middle of a gigantic thriving city with hundreds of thousands of people would make sense. Having it out in the middle of nowhere is just ridiculous. The 3 idiots notice a few guards milling around in the village, and they don't want to be seen, so they come up with the strategy of sticking to the tree line and then approaching the bank from the side so they won't be noticed. Now, I don't know why this dialogue was even included, because about 2 seconds later, these 3 idiots are walking in the open right up to the bank doors in clear view of everyone.
Truly, you have a dizzying intellect.
But now we have a great example of shallow writing by the show creators, because apparently these idiots were planning on robbing the bank, but I can't imagine how that would have even been possible. Let's assume they can take out or subdue the guards that should have been inside. How exactly are these idiots supposed to get away with the gold? Remember, they're supposed to be taking enough gold to hire an entire army of sellswords. You would need a wagon and a horse, and you would need to bring it up to the front door and start loading in all of that gold, because we are talking about literally thousands of pounds of gold here. You can't just throw it into a sack and walk out of the building with it. But this never needs to get answered, because they go into it completely unprepared, but luckily for them, sort of unluckily I suppose, they're surprised to see that the bank is empty and there's no gold to actually steal. So the problem of how do you get away with all the gold when you don't have a horse and a wagon never needs to be answered, because there is no gold in it. So it creates this problem, and it just kind of goes away because the writers decide to make this other stupid decision that kind of counteracts the original stupid decision. And it's just all sorts of nonsense. It's very incredibly shallow writing.
That's just lazy writing.
So as it turns out, the only thing in the bank is a dwarf sitting behind the desk, and he kind of laughs at them saying, haha, you can't steal the gold because there's no gold to steal. But don't worry, it gets worse. Outside, we hear a bunch of soldiers declaring very loudly that the enemies of the Golden Empire have been found, and they start marching towards the bank in order to capture the idiots. And it seems like the original plan of trying to sneak into the bank by using the tree line probably would have been a good idea, you know, instead of walking through the open like what they actually ended up doing. And it seems that they got spotted when they did that, so probably not a good idea. I don't exactly know what the writers were doing here. It feels like this script and these last couple scenes have been written by completely different people who didn't communicate with each other at all. They were each adding whatever they wanted to the story with no concern for how those two parts of the script would actually work together.
Now that's a bit of a problem.
At this point, the dwarf banker uses a trapdoor to escape through the floor, which the 3 idiots see him doing, so they absolutely know that there is a door there, and this is important because it's going to come up later. But somehow, when he goes through the trapdoor, he manages to place a lock on top of the door. You would think that if you're going to lock the trapdoor, you would probably want to do it from whatever side you're currently on, and it doesn't really make a lot of sense to put the lock on the other side of a door, but whatever. The reason why this needs to happen is so that the three idiots can use it later, you know, instead of right now, which would be the best option, but they're not going to because reasons. Since they're about to be attacked by a large group of soldiers, Mulan comes up with a plan to use the doorway in the bank as a choke point in order to even out the odds, making it so that only a few of them can fight at any given time. And this is actually a very good battle strategy, and I'm going to be surprised when they don't use it at all.
Mistakes were made, and I will find out who's responsible.
Also, you remember how in the first episode when we were told repeatedly that Mulan was supposed to be the best fighter in the world, that she is a master swordsman without peer? Yeah, take a look at this.
No.
Turns out that Mulan is such an unbelievably amazing swordsman that she doesn't know how to take a sword out of a scabbard properly. Call me crazy, but shouldn't that have been the very first thing you learned on day one of sword training school? Now, this might seem like it's a little thing and, you know, haha, she couldn't take her sword out of the scabbard. But remember, in the first episode, we were told repeatedly that Mulan was supposed to be the best fighter, the best swordsman in the entire world. How can we possibly take this character seriously as a master swordsman when she's not even able to properly draw her sword out of the scabbard? It's ridiculous.
Someone as unqualified as I am would ever be nominated for anything so important.
Regardless, remember how about 5 seconds ago I was saying that these idiots had a good strategy of using the door as a choke point? Well, that would have been a good strategy, except they don't do it for some reason. Remember how they said they were going to use the tree line to sneak into the bank and then they just walked into the open? And then just now they said, hey, we're going to use the door as a choke point? Well, they're not going to do that either. Why do you even bother to include this dialogue where they lay out whatever plan they're going to do when you immediately follow up with those characters not doing the thing that they said they were going to do?
It is a tale told by an idiot.
Despite the plan to use the door as a choke point, these three idiots are now standing in the middle of the room, and there's about 20 feet separating them from the door, which means that the soldiers could be using all of that space to easily overwhelm these three idiots. But for some bizarre reason, the soldiers only go into the building one or two at a time.
Not a great plan.
During the fighting, Malarkey moves to the back of the building, and Mulan yells at her to, quote, get back in formation, as if these three idiots standing in the center of the room actually mattered as a formation. Regardless, this scene was written and directed by people who have absolutely no concept of strategy and tactics or how to properly utilize them. But it gets even dumber. Eventually, the three idiots are forced to the very back of the building, and some of the soldiers finally realize that they don't actually need to fight. Instead, they can just go outside and set the entire building on fire. You know, the exact thing that they probably should have done first.
Madness. Madness and stupidity.
But don't worry, it gets worse. Speaking of stupid things that should have been done a while ago, now the three idiots realize that they can probably escape through the trap door, but it has a lock on it which is made from dwarven steel, which apparently is super strong and better than normal steel. Dogman doesn't know what to do, but Mulan says that her sword is also made of dwarven steel, and then he uses it to chop through the lock in a single strike.
Somehow Palpatine returned.
Let's stop and think about this for a second. We're supposed to believe that a sword made of dwarven steel is so sharp that it's capable of cutting through another solid piece of dwarven steel like butter. Wouldn't that mean that any shields or armor made from dwarven steel would be utterly useless against any kind of dwarven steel blade? I mean, if you can use a dwarven steel sword to chop through a dwarven steel lock, it stands to reason that the same sword could cut right through dwarven steel breastplates. So, what exactly would happen if someone blocked a dwarven steel sword with another dwarven steel sword? Both of the swords just get chopped in half? Is that what would happen? Are we supposed to believe that dwarven steel swords are so sharp that they're effectively lightsabers now? What is this nonsense?
That is an entirely implausible plot development.
This is another example of that shallow writing that I mentioned before. The writers want something to happen because they think it's cool or whatever, but they don't realize that it generates a huge amount of problems that they're probably just never even going to address for the rest of the series. Now we move back to the Empress, who is worried about her advisors and that they're going to try to get rid of her as soon as they don't need her anymore. However, it's very important to note that at this time, they absolutely still need her to be a figurehead for the Empire. If anything were to happen to her, it would cause chaos, and they definitely don't want that. That's why what happens next is even more stupid. Because the Empress is walking down the hallway, and she takes a corner to find a disheveled-looking man who suddenly attacks her with a knife.
This is bullshit.
Lucky for her, she is quickly saved by a mage who uses his magic to kill the attacker. This situation is completely and utterly implausible, and in fact, the elf using the magic is probably the most realistic part of this entire scene. That's how stupid it is. Remember, this woman is the Empress of the entire Golden Empire. She would have several bodyguards around her at all times, day or night, no matter what she was doing. There would always be guards right next to her every single moment of the day.
You don't have a better bad idea than this?
This is the best bad idea we have, sir.
And her advisors, even if they do plan on getting rid of her at some point in the future, right now, they absolutely need her to stay alive. And for this reason, the advisors would be even more inclined to ensure that there are guards surrounding the Empress at all times. It would make it all that much easier to control her actions and where she is allowed to go. The following scene even confirms this because she complains to her advisors that she doesn't know anything about what's going outside the walls of the castle because they're controlling her and they won't let her leave. Mr. Elfty then insists that she shouldn't even be allowed to walk around the castle anymore and she should be confined to her quarters. Again, it is obvious that they need her alive to control her. There is simply no way that this guy would be able to make it into the castle, wander around the different hallways and rooms until he's eventually able to find the Empress and then proceed to attack her. It's just not going to happen.
Don't you have to be stupid somewhere else?
There is no logical thought process that goes into the writing of this show. They simply need certain things to happen, so the writers make it happen, despite the fact that it's utterly nonsensical. Moments later, it's revealed that the guy who attacked her was someone who worked in the kitchens, so while he might have had access to the castle itself, again, there's simply no reason why she would have been left alone without any bodyguards. It's even dumber though, because one of her advisors, the general, even says that this is, quote, a massive oversight, and that from now on they may need to assign a guard to her. A single guard, one person to guard the Empress. The idea that the most high-ranked general in the army would not realize the Empress needs to have guards on a 24/7 basis is absurd.
Look at this idiot. One ball and no brains.
However, the Empress decides that she wants to choose who the bodyguard is going to be, so she picks the mage that just saved her life. But since he has a stupidly long, nearly unpronounceable name, I'm just going to call him Albert. It moves back to the village with the bank, and we see some elf guy who's trying to track down the three idiots. For some bizarre reason, the entire village is now empty. Not a single person anywhere to be found except this one dude. The bank is still smoldering a little bit in the distance, but we can see that it's still standing because half of it was made of metal. Apparently, the elite soldiers that were sent to capture the three idiots didn't feel like sticking around to verify that the job had been done. They never went into the building to see, oh, hey, yeah, there's no skeletons in here. There's nobody here. We didn't actually get them. Oh, yeah, look, there's a trapdoor that they could escape from. Oh, hey, the merchant, the banker that was inside this building who escaped through the trapdoor never bothered to come over and tell us that there was a trapdoor that the three idiots could escape from. We never bothered to go and check on any of that. We're just going to pretend that the building that's still standing somehow ended up taking out the three idiots. Good job.
Your crap! Why do you always do these stupid things?
Back in the castle, the Empress is talking to Albert about how she knows that the advisors are going to try to get rid of her at some point, so she wants him to spy on her advisors. Then she says that she needs to leave the castle in order to see how things are doing for herself, so she asks Albert to give her his cloak. The next scene is the Empress walking around outside the castle.
I'm sorry. What?
I can't help but think that there was some crucial stuff in between these two scenes that we as the audience probably should have been able to see, but somehow we're expected to believe that the most important person in the entire castle and in the Empire itself is able to just walk out of the front gate of the castle without any of the guards recognizing her simply because she's wearing a new cloak.
I have questions.
And it's not even like the hood does a very good job of hiding her. You can still very clearly see her face. This is even more absurd than the attacker incident that just happened a few minutes ago. What's even dumber is that while she is walking around outside, again, not a single person recognizes her. Even though she is the newly crowned empress, she was still a member of the royal family and a princess before that. I would have to imagine that at least a few people in that city would be able to recognize her. But don't worry, it gets worse. As she's walking around through the city, she walks into one of her advisors, the general, and I mean, she quite literally walks into him. They bump into each other, and yet somehow he doesn't recognize her.
Any idea who I am?
It's even dumber than that, because not only does the general not recognize the Empress when he is standing literally 1 foot away from her after bumping into her, he also doesn't even recognize the very vibrant blue cloak that the mage was wearing that he was talking to not even 5 minutes ago.
How come God hogs up all the good followers and me get all the retards?
I know that the writing in this show is extraordinarily contrived, but even this stretches the limits. Predictably, the Empress decides she's going to follow him, and finally we arrive at the moment that everyone has been waiting for. This is that thing that we were promised by the show creators and the actors themselves. This is the single most important thing to ever happen in all of the Witcher series, because when the general goes inside of a building to meet his lover, it turns out to be a man.
Maybe they're one of those gay couples.
Apparently, the dude that he's involved with is a merchant of some kind, but he might be doing some shady stuff that the Empire won't like, but the general doesn't really care that it's happening. He's more concerned that they would both get caught.
Let's go blow this guy.
Now, I want to briefly pause for a second to give all of you the opportunity to go down into the comment section below, and I want you to leave a comment on what you think the name of this merchant guy is going to be. And remember, this is a fantasy series, so he's probably going to have some kind of a very fanciful name, just like all of the other characters in the series. We have names like Merwin and Zakari and Meldorf and Avalok and Jaskier and Sindril and Eregin and all that and on and on and on and on. So leave your comment. What do you think this guy's name is gonna be? So it has to be something elaborate and fancy, right? Well, as it turns out, this guy's name is Brian.
You serious?
His name is Brian. His name is Brian. It's fucking Brian! To be clear, this is not short for anything else. It's not a nickname or an alias. This character's name in a story where every single other character in town and village and everything else in the entire world has a fanciful name. Instead, this is the one gay dude who's being played by a dark-skinned Indian actor, and his name is Brian. His name is fucking Brian.
This makes no sense to us.
Now, if you're new to the channel, you may not have noticed this yet, but I tend to make up silly names to use for characters as a way of poking fun at them. But I honestly don't think I could come up with a better name than Brian. That in and of itself is more than a joke enough. Regardless, it then moves over to Mr. Elfty, who's talking to the obese deaf girl we saw in the promotions. Apparently, he trusts the ODG implicitly because he reveals to her that the sparkles from the other world has granted him some sort of power, and it's going to cause him to change into something, which is probably going to look like more terrible CGI. Back with the three idiots, we're introduced to another character. This is the guy who showed up at the village with the bank. There's some artificial tension between these characters, and it was incredibly predictable because the show creators wanted to make it look, oh, this guy's tracking him down and he's gonna try to start a fight, but it was very obvious that he was not doing that. Like, it was painfully obvious that he was there in order to be friends with them and to join up with them. So everything, just like everything else in this show, it's just artificial garbage. After some back and forth, the guy introduces himself as Brother Death. Although Brother Dumbass is probably more appropriate. He claims that the Empire destroyed his village and now he wants to join up with the idiots. Also very predictable, who cares? We then see that Mulan is very sick because she took a wound when fighting in the bank, and apparently the blade was poisoned. Yeah, you couldn't get enough of that trope, huh? This is the sort of thing that might happen if it was an assassin, maybe? But considering that the guys they were fighting was just some random dude who was working as a soldier for the Empire, the idea that he would use poison on his sword is kinda ridiculous.
No. I mean, no. Just statistically, no.
Once again, the writers are making stuff happen, even though it doesn't make any sense. Then Malarkey says that Mulan will be dead by the following day, but luckily, Brother Dumbass just happens to know a healer in the area. As they're traveling to the healer, they come across a large patch of land that probably has about 50 fog machines running at full blast. Brother Dumbass turns around and tells them that no matter what they see, they need to move forward, and then he just walks into the mist. No further explanation at all. Both Dogman and Malarkey is subjected to terrible memories and visions from their past, but eventually they make it through. I can't help but think that perhaps Brother Dumbass probably should have given at least a tiny bit more of explanation on what was going to happen.
Yeah, my bad. Won't happen again.
They try to make some stupid excuse for it later by saying, well, we needed to know if your heart was true, but it's just awful and dumb. Regardless, all of the idiots make it to the center of whatever, and then we meet up with the healer and some other guy named Syndrel. Dogman is mad at him for some reason, but the healer doesn't allow the two of them to fight. Now we move back to Tinkerbell, who I gotta say honestly reminds me quite a bit of Arya Stark, especially with the whole revenge mission type thing. So far we've only had one scene with this character, and you would probably expect that most of her storyline is going to be trying to track down this guy, except that's not the case at all because now he's dead.
Interesting.
Now that I think about it though, perhaps the comparison to Arya Stark isn't such a good one. After all, it took Arya about 6 or 7 seasons in order to fulfill her quest for revenge, and Tinkerbell managed to do it in a grand total of 2 scenes and less than 5 minutes of screen time. It's like she was speedrunning the whole quest for revenge thing.
Now that's what I call an epic gamer moment.
This is not how you create a compelling story. What you're supposed to do is introduce a character, then present some goal that they want to work towards, and over the course of the story, they will then work towards that goal until eventually they're able to achieve it. All that gets thrown out the window if you introduce a character, and in the first scene you present the problem, and then you completely solve the problem in the second scene. There is no character growth here. There is no story here. When you have the entire character wrapped up within 2 scenes, what is even the point of including that character at all?
What a story!
We do learn a little bit more about this useless character. Apparently she was in love with another female dwarf because, obviously, gotta check more of those diversity boxes, and the soldier, who of course happens to be a white guy, did some bad stuff to her. So that's twice this show has pulled that bullshit. Once in the tavern in the first episode where a white guy did some bad stuff to one of the female staff, and then here's the second where a white guy did some bad stuff to the female dwarf. It's almost like there's a pattern. It's almost like the writers have some sort of stupid agenda that they're trying to push that they think is more important than having actual story.
You're a stupid man! A stupid, stupid man!
Also, I still can't tell if Tinkerbell is crazy, but she does keep talking to her hammer as if it's the dead girl, but honestly, I don't care about this character at all. But don't worry, it gets worse. Remember how the Empress wasn't allowed to leave the room? Well, apparently now she can, and she doesn't even bother to hide. She just goes out in her normal clothing. Not only that, but she's once again by herself, and she's just walking through the streets with no bodyguards at all.
It's not really a smart thing to do.
We see the general waking up in the merchant's house after spending the night with Brian playing hide the hot dog. The Empress is in the other room talking to Brian, flaunting the fact that she knows about the General and Brian. The General, seeing this, gets a little scared and is planning on attacking and killing the Empress, which honestly doesn't seem like the greatest idea, but before he even gets the chance to make his move, the Empress reveals that she is going to make Brian a member of the High Council and give him some fancy titles. Essentially, her plan is to bribe these 2 clowns so that working with her is more beneficial than working with Mr. Alfti. Unsurprisingly, there's some really stupid dialogue during this conversation. The General asks why he should risk it and go against Mr. Alfti, and the Empress says that Mr. Alfti is just low-born scum, and he views both of them with contempt. Now, funny she should say this because Brian is also low-born scum.
I am insulted on your behalf.
Of course, that was the entire purpose of giving Brian a bunch of fancy titles and a seat on the High Council, because even though he was born low-born scum, he's going to be kind of elevated to a prestigious place within the Empire, and I don't understand why Mr. Alfti wouldn't be able to get the same thing. And the fact that he is one of the chief advisors to the Empress kind of, goes against the whole lowborn scum thing. It doesn't really matter where he was born in this case because he holds one of the most powerful positions in the entire empire. So why would he or anyone else still consider him to be lowborn scum?
I barely have a reason to care, and even I notice.
What's more ridiculous about this is both the Empress and the General are insulting Mr. Alfti as lowborn scum, and yet they both fail to realize that Brian is also lowborn scum. The Empress also says that she wants the Dogman to be taken in alive as part of their bargain, and then she leaves the house to let the General think about it. Back with the Fellowship of the Idiots, we get some more story about Sindril. He made a very brief appearance in the first episode where he was locked in some sort of magical cell by Mr. Alfti. In this scene, he's explaining to Dogman that he did work with Mr. Alfti and that they went to another world, but he got scared and Mr. Alfti locked him in a magical cell. He claims that he was stuck in the cell for quite a while. However, after he witnessed the terrible CGI kill the king, Sindril escaped and fled the city. And that's all we hear from that. He was trapped in a magical cell with no hope of getting out, and yet suddenly here he is with the healer and absolutely no explanation whatsoever on how he actually escaped.
Logic is an integral part of narrative structure.
Remember earlier when the Empress wanted to leave the castle and we get a scene of her with the cloak, and then the following scene is her outside and we had no explanation whatsoever on how she actually got out of the castle? This is just like that, except way, way worse. The guy was trapped in a magical cell, and yet somehow he managed to escape, and the writers thought that it was a good idea to include only a single line of dialogue where he just says that he escaped, and that's it. I can't believe this. It's so unbelievably lazy and contrived.
That is the stupidest story I ever heard.
And speaking of lazy and contrived garbage, even though Mulan was on the very brink of death, the healer is able to bring her back to complete 100% health with almost no effort at all, and it only takes a few seconds.
Got better.
I'd like to point out that any person who is capable of performing that kind of miraculous healing would be the wealthiest person in the entire world.
Show me the money!
We get an exposition dump from Sindril about how the gateways to other worlds are creating long-lasting rips and that energy from other worlds is leaking into theirs. This is causing problems with magic, and it's also going to end up destroying the entire world in just a couple days.
Boy, that escalated quickly.
In order to stop it, they need to destroy the primary monolith, which is located at the Empress's castle. However, that's on the other side of the world, and it would take them weeks to get there. But Sindril says that they can use a different monolith to create a portal that will take them directly to the primary monolith. He says that the primary monolith won't be protected because Mr. Alfti doesn't know that sort of thing is possible. Honestly, though, that shouldn't even matter. The primary monolith is the single most important object in the world at the moment for the Empire. The existence of that primary monolith is the key to all of their plans going forward and how they're going to invade other worlds. Mr. Alfti is absolutely going to have that primary monolith protected no matter what. Regardless, the Fellowship of the Idiots travels to another nearby monolith where it's being guarded by a grand total of 3 people. It's just 3 people sitting around in the middle of the woods. There isn't any kind of a fort to protect the monolith, no tower. There isn't a wooden palisade. There isn't even a small fence. I don't know where these soldiers are sleeping either because there are no buildings of any kind in the area. They don't even have a tent set up. Okay, sure, this isn't the primary monolith, but as we've already learned throughout the first 2 episodes, these extra monoliths are very important because they're needed to kind of extra empower the primary monolith, which is used to go to other worlds and this and that and something, whatever. The point is that even those other monoliths are still very important and they need to be protected. But for whatever reason, this monolith is just sitting out in the middle of the woods with 3 incompetent soldiers to guard it.
For some reason.
They easily take out the soldiers and Cindy makes a portal, but it doesn't take them to the castle or the primary monolith. Instead, they end up in some other world where they get attacked by more terrible CGI. I suppose on the good side, though, at least this terrible CGI is incapable of firing out lightning bolts, so, I mean, good for them. I would hate for anyone to watch this series and somehow mistakenly believe that this is how you're supposed to write a story. Putting aside all the woke garbage and the bad special effects, the writing and the dialogue here is simply terrible. The character of Tinkerbell being able to completely resolve her quest for revenge in only 2 scenes in under 5 minutes is absurd. Allowing the Empress and the General to walk around in the city with no guards and no one noticing who they are is nonsensical. Having the poison blade, the bank with the trapdoor, all of this, everything is so utterly contrived and unbelievable. For any prospective writers out there, take a good look at this series, because this is the exact opposite of what you should be doing. But thankfully, that's the end of episode 2.
I'm taking shots at the enemy. I'm gonna make it to the top, leave a legacy. If I got something to say, you better let me speak. Turn it up a new degree, bitch, you ain't seen anything. I pop off with the new rock, electronic, blow the sonic roof up. I'm too honest when I take a few shots. They're too toxic, need to take the noose off.